Donald Trump has never actually been a big ideological opponent of trans people, but he has picked up the ball from the Republican base and ran with it. And his administration has been the most brutal to trans people in the history of this country. And now we can see a Texas employee has been fired after refusing to remove pronouns from their email signature. A former employee of the Texas Real Estate Commission, a state agency, said he was fired from his job after refusing to remove pronouns from his email signature. Frank Zamora, 32, told the Austin American-Statesman that he viewed the directive, which came from Governor Greg Abbott, as part of a broader effort to make LGBT plus people feel unwelcome in the state of Texas. Newsweek contacted TREC for comment on Thursday via online inquiry form outside of regular office hours. Why it matters. Issues around transgender rights have received national attention in recent years, with proponents arguing that they are human rights and critics arguing that they can infringe on women's rights. Upon returning to office on January 20th, President Donald Trump signed a number of executive orders related to the issue. One order says the U.S. government recognizes only two sexes, male and female. Another bars most transgender personnel from the military, while another bars transgender athletes from women's sports at federally funded schools. Many of Trump's orders have received legal challenges highlighting the divide over trans rights. What to know? On January 30th, Abbott wrote a letter to state agencies saying the state of Texas recognizes only two sexes, male and female. He also referenced Trump's defending women from gender ideology extremism and restoring biological truth to the federal government executive order, which adopted the same policy on the federal level. The governor instructed agency chairs and directors to follow state and federal law and recognize the biological reality that there are only two sexes. In response, an email obtained by the Austin American-Statesman showed TREC Director Chelsea Buchholz told employees the agency is modifying its employee email signature block template by removing preferred pronouns. So they're just giving the game away. When they are banning preferred pronouns from being used in email signatures, it has nothing to do with trans ideology. It has nothing to do with getting men out of women's sports or protecting our children and having them not undergo gender changing surgery. It has everything to do with stamping out the idea that gender is different from sex altogether. Because once you start differentiating gender from sex, then you can start believing how it could be possible for someone to be trans. It could be possible for someone to present themselves in a different way that is deviating from the stereotypical norm of the sex that they were born with. So really, this is an attack on thought and it's an attack on truth. It has nothing to do with trans people when you are banning your preferred pronouns from your email chain. What people are saying. Speaking to the Austin American-Statesman about Texas's policy on transgender rights, Frank Zamora said, "I could not in good conscience contribute to those actions in any way, no matter how small." He added, "There have been multiple occasions when I stop and I ask myself, is this really happening? I mean, I'm talking about pronouns. That someone should be fired over it. That it's become this politicized and this weaponized is not only ridiculous, but it's a little bit laughable." And I think that is the attitude that people that are fighting for trans people, that are fighting for just the simple truth of the matter and fighting for reality against this wrong think that we are seeing being cracked down on by the Republicans, that's the attitude that you need to have. Just completely ridicule their hyperbolic freak out over small words. It's simply a part of our language. It's a part of the way that we communicate with each other. And Republicans aren't even able to deal with that. They are so afraid of the truth, they can't even comprehend and reckon with people using language to describe themselves. It goes against their worldview. And this is why people say that the Christian fundamentalist worldview is utterly fragile and held up by nothing. It's held up by nothing. Summer Mandel, a TREC spokesman, told the Austin American-Statesman, "As a Texas state agency within the executive branch, we follow Governor Abbott's directives." Governor Greg Abbott shared the Austin American-Statesman article on X, formerly Twitter, writing, "A Texas state employee refused to remove pronouns from email signature. He was fired before noon." And so we can get into this. So he writes his tweet, and Musk hyped up the firing with 2 fire emojis. The billionaire himself laid off thousands of federal employees through the Department of Government Efficiency in recent weeks. A Texas state employee refused to remove pronouns from email signature. He was fired before noon. And this is being hyped up by Greg Abbott, who is an all-star in the Republican Party. It's also being hyped up by Elon Musk, who is basically the Republican Party right now. And this is really going to be, we've already seen transgender people being discriminated against through legal methods. We can take, we read it here. Donald Trump has passed executive orders saying that the government only recognizes 2 sexes. Another bars transgender people from the military and transgender athletes from women's sports. This is straight up discriminatory on its face.
I also signed an executive order to ban men from playing in women's sports. Three years ago, Peyton McNabb was an all-star high school athlete, one of the best, preparing for a future in college sports. But when her girls' volleyball match was invaded by a male, he smashed the ball so hard in Peyton's face, causing traumatic brain injury, partially paralyzing her right side and ending her athletic career. It was a shot like she's never seen before. She's never seen anything like it. Peyton is here tonight in the gallery, and Peyton, from now on, schools will kick the men off the girls' team, or they will lose all federal funding.
So, using the tool of funding schools to attack trans people. And that's not all. So as ridiculous as getting fired because you are including pronouns is, a new Texas bill is outright trying to criminalize being trans as a felony, as felony fraud. The bill, brought by legislator Tom Oliverson, likely will not pass. However, it represents a new front in attacks on transgender people and connects with other attempts to label being trans as fraud. This is simple transphobia. This is simply the idea of a Republican fearing to death that they're going to go out to a bar, see an attractive woman, and then find out that she has a penis when they bring her home. This is simply this is homophobia externalized. This is internalized homophobia externalized into a bill brought by a Republican state senator. A new bill introduced by far-right Republican legislator Tom Oliverson, HB 3817, seeks to criminalize being transgender by classifying it as a felony fraud. While the bill has no co-sponsors, making its passage significantly less likely, it marks a significant escalation in anti-trans legislation. It is the first measure to explicitly criminalize identifying as a gender different from one's sex assigned at birth and communicating that identity to others. The proposal also aligns with broader efforts at the state and federal levels, including Trump administration policies that seek to label transgender existence as fraud. The bill states that transgender individuals who make false or misleading verbal or written statements to their employer or the government are guilty of felony fraud if that statement identifies the person's biological sex as the opposite of the biological sex assigned to the person at birth. This language effectively criminalizes transgender people for merely existing and identifying as their gender identity. Beyond employment, the bill could also apply to interactions with law enforcement, attempts to update gender markers on official documents, and other routine disclosures of gender identity. If enacted, it would amount to the direct criminalization of being transgender, with felony fraud charges carrying the potential for jail time. See the full bill here. And so we can just read the snippet through this. Gender identity fraud. A person commits an offense if the person knowingly makes a false or misleading verbal or written statement to a governmental entity or the person's employer by identifying the person's biological sex as the opposite of the biological sex assigned to the person at birth. So if you are a passing trans person and you have fully transitioned socially, you've transitioned medically, and you are happy with your life, If your employer finds out you're trans, they can fire you because of it, because Donald Trump got rid of being trans as a protected status. And now you are being forced to identify to your employer that you're trans. Otherwise, you could be arrested and have it be a felony fraud if Republicans could have their way. So this is really ridiculous. And it is just a full out attack on trans people. Gender affirming care for youth. Trump says, and now I want Congress to pass a bill permanently banning criminalizing sex changes on children and forever ending the lie that any child is trapped in the wrong body. This is a big lie, and our message to every child in America is that you are perfect exactly the way God made you. So once again, this is extremely religious fundamentalist language that Donald Trump is using, and this whole anti-trans issue is used to appease the religious fundamentalist base that Donald Trump has, because really he can't offer his supporters anything else. He can't even offer them cheaper gas or cheaper eggs. His entire government is geared towards enriching himself and his billionaire oligarch friends that are clapping him on the back and kissing his ass all the way to the bank. He has nothing of substance to offer. So all he can offer people that aren't billionaires and aren't sucking up to him are these just downright vicious and evil acts. All he can offer people is completely expunging trans people from public existence, and the other thing that he can offer is the complete deportation and dehumanization of immigrants. And his supporters, even though they're not getting any economic advantages from his time in office, they are eating well when it comes to them just being evil and malicious. And they are eating well when it comes to human suffering of their enemies, because trans people are suffering. And people that are here legally and illegally are suffering. People that are documented, and they are in this country, are suffering just as much as the people that are undocumented, because they're being targeted just as much. Some of Trump's biggest applause lines so far has been in response to his comments on transgender-related policies. This section wasn't in the excerpts of his prepared remarks on the White House shared, but it ended up in the first 30 minutes of the speech. Trump tonight spoke about former volleyball player Peyton McNabb, a high school athlete who was injured from a volleyball spike from a trans woman on the opposing team. Sounds like a skill issue. One of Trump's top campaign promises was getting men out of women's sports. As he at his rallies, the anti-woke talking points, particularly related to trans issues, consistently received the biggest cheers. And so he knows this is a big issue that he can get easy points on. Oh, you just need me to dehumanize and villainize another group of people and strip away their rights? Sure, then that's Donald Trump's favorite thing. And this really gets into the question, so we need to put this into perspective. The prevalence of gender-affirming surgical procedures among minors and adults in the United States. Well, first of all, we need to determine how many trans people actually are there in the United States. So we looked at this, and in 2017 and 2019, when this study took a look at the CDC's behavior, when they looked at different surveys and provided an opportunity to update prior population estimates on the number of adults and youth who identify as transgender in 2016 and 2017, the Williams Institute looked at multiple surveys, and then this is the results. Over 1.6 million adults ages 18 and older and youth 13 to 17 identify as transgender in the United States, or 0.6% of those ages 13 and older. 0.6% of people 13 and older identified as trans in the United States. Among U.S. adults, 0.5% identify as transgender. Among youth ages 13 to 17 in the U.S., 1.4% identify as transgender. So 0.5% identify as transgender above the age of 18, and from 13 to 17, 1.4%. Of the 1.3 million adults who identify as transgender, 38% are transgender women, 35% are transgender men, 25% reported they are gender nonconforming. And once again, the Republicans never have anything to do when we're talking about transgender men, because they can't fearmonger as effectively as they can when they talk about transgender women. When they talk about transgender women, they complain that a female rising star college athlete got her place taken by this man who couldn't hack it in their cisgender division. And so they go into the women's division so that they can have some kind of newly formed success. And so they fearmonger off of that, but they really have nothing to say when it comes to the almost equal amount of people that are transgendered men. Research shows transgender individuals are younger on average than the U.S. population. The racial ethnic distribution of youth and adults who identify as transgender appears generally similar to the U.S. population. Our estimates of the percent of residents in the U.S. region who identify as transgender range from 1.8% in the Northeast, 1.2% in the Midwest, and range from 0.6% in the Northeast to 0.4% in the Midwest for adults. On the state level, our estimates range from 3% of youth ages 13 to 17 as identifies transgender in New York to 0.6% in Wyoming. Our estimates for the percentage of adults who identify as transgender range from 0.9% in North Carolina to 0.2% in Missouri. So, funnily enough, the liberal New York City doesn't have the highest amount of transgender people. Or yeah, actually, I guess it does. And then if we can also take a look at how many transgender athletes play women's sports. So transgender people are again at the center of the GOP's crosshairs after a recent bill outlawing transgender athletes from competing in girls' and women's sports passed the U.S. House along party lines on Thursday. The bill, titled Protection of Women in Girls Sports Act, and authored by Florida Republican Greg Steube, is not expected to pass the Democrat-controlled Senate. So this is old. But we can take a look at how many transgender athletes are in the U.S. Of the estimated 332 million citizens living in the United States, 1.3 million adults and 300,000 youth ages 13 to 17 identifies transgender, equaling 0.5% and 1.4% of the population, respectively, according to a report published by Williams Institute. So that was what we just read. Not all transgender people identify as women, and an even smaller number consists of transgender women hoping to compete in girls' and women's sports. Privacy laws make it tough to identify the exact number of transgender athletes competing in public school sports, but researcher and medical physicist Joanna Harper estimates the number can't exceed 100 nationwide. While we don't know the exact number of trans women competing in NCAA sports, it would be very surprised if there were more than 100 of them in the women's category. So we have this whole public outrage over 100 people. And once again, we need to put this into perspective. It is a microscopic amount of people when it comes to a country as big as the United States. It is a completely meaningless issue that the Republicans have blown up. And really, it is another example of satanic panic. People see transgender people just trying to live their life, enjoy their life. If they're an athlete, they want to compete in sports because that's what athletes do, and they cannot have that. They cannot have that. I've always said that liberals will look at people and say, oh, I'll live and let live. I'll live my life the way that I want to live my life, and I'll let you live your life the way you want to live your life, as long as it's not affecting other people and impinging on their rights. And Republicans will say, I'll live my life the way I want to live my life, and I want you to live your life the way I want you to live your life. So really, Republican policies when it comes to social policies and when it comes to like culture war stuff is all aggrievement. It's all controlling people for the sake of controlling them, and it has no standing or impact on their lives whatsoever. Once again, more examples of Trump's ways to exclude trans people from public life. Passports denied. We saw this really popularized lately, where passports are now reverting back to what your gender is stated on your birth certificate. So your passports are now going to For people that have fully transitioned into a different gender, their passports are going to describe them as the gender that they are not presenting as anymore. Passports are denied. Trans people are worried they will be unable to travel abroad with these passports, and more are worried about inconsistent documentation causing them to experience harassment when they travel through airports or other checkpoints. So once again, this is simply making life worse for trans people, and that's because Republicans don't want trans people to have a good life. They simply want them to suffer. School censorship. President Trump has directed the federal government to begin a campaign to monitor and influence K through 12 curriculum. This includes eliminating federal funding for schools that promote indoctrination based on gender ideology and discriminatory equity ideology. Discriminatory equity ideology, literally the opposite of discriminatory. This directive isn't new, although it uses new language. Since 2020, Republicans in red states have tried to restrict teaching critical race theory, black history, intersectionality, and social justice. And bills to restrict how teachers can discuss gender identity and sexual orientation are entwined with this effort. Florida's curriculum censorship law, nicknamed Don't Say Gay by LGBTQ plus activists, is likely the most well-known example of state LGBTQ plus education restrictions. So this is basically just federalizing the anti-gay bills that we've seen on the state level. Gender-affirming care restrictions. Hospitals in blue states like Massachusetts and New York, where gender-affirming care is protected under state law, stopped providing that care to trans adolescents and young trans adults following an executive order signed by Trump in late January. That's according to a lawsuit against the administration by major LGBTQ plus active advocacy groups. 2 federal judges have temporarily blocked enforcement of Trump's order, but healthcare access for young trans people in the U.S. is still largely uncertain. Some clinics have yet to resume services. Others have taken steps to remove public references to the trans health services that they still do offer to avoid government scrutiny and federal funding cuts. In other cases, trans patients are being denied equal treatment while still technically receiving the same services. And we can take a look at this study, which looks at the prevalence of gender-affirming surgical procedures among minors and adults. So we looked at the trans athletes, and it's less than 100. And we can take a look at how many youth and adults are actually medically transitioning. In 2019, 47 million adults who were insured and 22 million minors who were insured, of which 3.8 million in minors were aged 15 to 17, 2.7 were aged 13 to 14, and 16.2 were aged 12 or younger. The rate of undergoing a gender-affirming surgery with a TGD, this is a transgender and that is transgender and gender diagnosed. Yeah, transgender and gender diverse people. So the rate of undergoing a gender-affirming surgery with a TGD-related diagnosis was 5.3 per 100,000 total adults, compared with 2.1 per 100,000 minors aged 15 to 17, 0.1 per 100,000 minors aged 13 to 14, and 0 procedures among minors aged 12 years or younger. Of gender-affirming surgical procedures identified among adults and minors, 1,591 of 2,664 and 82 of 85 were chest-related procedures, respectively. Of the 636 breast reductions among cisgender males and TGD adults, 507, 80% were performed on cisgender males. Of the 151 breast reductions among cisgender male minors and TGD minors, 146 and 97% were performed on cisgender male minors. So what does this all mean? What it all means is that there are barely any trans people actually getting surgeries. And when it comes to minors, the number is even less. 5.3 per 100,000 adults received gender-affirming surgery, and 2.1 per 100,000 minors 15 to 17 received gender-affirming surgery, 0.1 per 100,000 minors aged 13 to 14 received gender-affirming surgery, and 0 procedures among minors aged 12 or younger received gender-affirming surgery. Of the gender-affirming surgical procedures identified among adults and minors, 59% were surgeries done on adults. 96.4% were gender-affirming surgeries of the chest, were chest-related procedures among minors. And out of that 96.4% among minors, 97% were performed on cisgender males. So literally, it's cisgender males getting gender affirming surgery. That's the vast majority of gender affirming surgeries for minors is done on cisgender males getting chest reductions. Like, you just can't make this stuff up. And this is the crusade. This is the social issue of our time that Republicans and religious fundamentalists are freaking out over. It cannot be a smaller issue. It could not possibly be a smaller issue. There's a bigger issue of people kissing frogs and getting warts because they're trying to find princesses or princes. That's a bigger issue than the number of youth getting surgeries to become trans. It's insane. Rates of gender affirming surgical procedures associated with a transgender and gender diverse related diagnosis per 100,000 people in 2019. All adults, what is this, 5.5. Children aged 15 to 17, 2.1, about 0.1, and then 0. It's just a non-issue when, like, it's a non-issue when we're talking about adults. And then even before adults, there's like barely any gender affirming surgeries. And the gender affirming surgeries that do happen, 90%, 97% of gender affirming surgeries that do happen are performed on cisgender males trying to affirm their cisgender status. And all of this is having an effect on people. So I wanted to play this little anecdote to wrap this segment up. An Iowan with transgender child reacts to state's elimination of protections. Iowa eliminated anti-discrimination protections for transgender people from its civil rights law. NPR's Lila Fadel talks to Matt McIver, an Iowan with a transgender child. And I think this is just an important anecdote for us to listen to and wrap this up to see how all of these policies are affecting real people.
Iowa removed transgender and non-binary people as a protected group in the state civil rights law. Governor Kim Reynolds signed a bill last week striking the words gender identity from that law. She says the language blurred the lines between the sexes.
What this bill does accomplish is to strengthen protections for women and girls, and I believe that it is the right thing to do.
She said that this provides protections for women in sports and in restrooms. So what's it mean for people who lose that language? Our colleague Layla Fadel spoke with Matt McIver, a parent of a transgender teen in Des Moines.
You know, I remember speaking to you 2 years ago when Governor Reynolds banned gender-affirming care for trans minors, and you had met with her to try to persuade her not to sign that bill into law. And now there is this rollback in the civil rights law, meaning your child is no longer protected under it. What do you make of her comment that this is about protecting women and girls?
It's the smallest kind of fig leaf, Layla. It is an excuse to persecute an ongoing attack on a vulnerable community. If they were actually interested in helping women, they would be doing something about Iowa's rising maternal mortality rate. They wouldn't pass a 6-week abortion ban, which puts women's lives in danger. There's any number of ways in which they could actually help women if they were interested in that, but it's not something that they're genuinely interested in doing. It's an excuse.
It feels like persecution?
I think it's more than feels at this point. If our rights are not rights for everyone, they're simply privileges that are granted to in-groups. This is an attack on the fundamental rights of Iowans, and it is an attack that undermines our state's motto, which is our liberties we prize and our rights we will maintain.
If you could just break down for people what it means when a group of people is removed as a protected class from the civil rights law in Iowa. What does that mean for Iowans who are transgender, who were once protected, who are now not?
It means that you can be evicted from your apartment simply for being transgender or being believed to be transgender. It means you can be denied a credit card simply for being transgender or being believed to be transgender. It means you can be fired from a job for being transgender or being believed to be transgender. You do not have the fundamental protections that we expect in a civil society. It's a horrifying thing that they did, and it has nothing to do with sports. If you look at athletes, transgender athletes are something like 0.001% of NCAA athletes. It's a ridiculously small number, and as a result, they are an easier target than many other groups that have better representation.
How's your family doing? How's your son doing?
I appreciate that. We have 2 LGBTQ kids. It's upsetting and distressing for the kids, for sure. But I'm not as worried about my kids. My wife and I will make sure that our kids are fine. There are lots of kids who aren't going to have the luxury of knowing that.
I mean, I don't know if you want to share this, but how old is your son?
Teenage years.
Teenage years. Okay. If you feel comfortable, was there a conversation after this happened? And what was that conversation?
I'm going to keep this a little bit vague, Layla, just because
Sure.
This is a less safe state than it was even when you and I spoke 2 years ago.
So you don't even feel safe being really specific about this conversation because of the laws?
I would say that, yes. I'm comfortable talking to you. I'm a person who checks pretty much every box of privilege that there is. But I know for a fact that this is a less safe place for LGBTQ folks, and I would like to be a little bit protective.
So you're scared for your child?
I am.
And then you said you're going to be a bit vague, but do you want to share anything within that vague, sort of comfortable category?
Yeah, I appreciate that. I said that this is awful. I said that it's wrong. I said that we're going to keep fighting. But I told them, pardon the language, but it sucks. I don't know if I can say that. But I used to think that once rights were secured, they were safe. But we've seen that that's not true in this country, that there are people who will try and strip away rights from others to make themselves, I don't know, feel big, feel better. And we have to continue to fight for the rights of everyone. Because once we start stripping away rights from someone, no one is safe.
Matt McIver of Des Moines, Iowa, a parent. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
So, yeah, it does suck. And it is simply a political move to scapegoat a group of people. We've seen this before, and we're going to continue seeing it as long as the Republican Party continues to have zero to offer the American people in terms of material benefits to their lives. We are going to continue to see this viciousness, this cruelty, and this targeting of minority demographic groups. So, yeah, do not accept the framing that this is women protecting women's sports. Do not accept the framing that this is protecting women in their bathrooms. Do not accept any kind of framing of this conversation other than this is an attack on a demographic minority. Okay? Trans women are women. An attack on women is also going to include an attack on trans women. If we are stripping rights away from this group of people, other people can also get their rights stripped away. So we cannot stand for any kind of legislation dehumanizing and allowing the discrimination over a group of people, especially not one based off of intrinsic characteristics like your gender identity and how you present yourself as. This is a religious, fundamentalist, authoritarian crackdown on our fundamental human rights.